May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. One of my favorite popular Christian books is The Jesus I Never Knew by Philip Yancey. Is it familiar to anybody? Have you ever read it? Anyone here? Anybody? Oh, good. It's back there somewhere. You know, it was published in 1995, which is almost long enough to consider it a classic, and I've used it as a book study for many, many sessions. In the book, Yancey examines cultural perceptions about Jesus by looking at how he has been portrayed in the movies. He also challenges his own ideas about Jesus. Yancey recalls that the Jesus he knew from his Sunday school days. And he writes that his Sunday school Jesus was, quote, someone kind and reassuring with no sharp edges at all. In other words, Mr. Rogers before the age of children's television. Now, I suspect that those of us who spent time in Sunday school can relate to what Yancey is talking about. And I'll admit that even as an adult, my favorite way of imagining Jesus is as someone gentle, loving, and welcoming to all kinds of people. And I think actually the gospel record certainly bears that out as one way to imagine what Jesus was like. But the Gospels also present us with other images of Jesus that are far removed from Sunday school or Mr. Rogers. That is certainly the case in this morning's Gospel, which presents Jesus as someone who is mad as hell and not going to take it anymore. The story of Jesus overturning the tables and driving the sellers and money changers out of the temple confronts us with one of the most disturbing presentations of Jesus in all of the scriptures. It's one of the handful of stories about Jesus that's recorded in all four Gospels, which means it's really important to our understanding of who Jesus is. But unlike the other stories in that category, it's so uncomfortable to hear that we only read it on Sunday morning once every 3 years. So if you're really bothered by this story, you're in luck. You don't have to hear it again until 2027. Now, the Gospels, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, place this story as happening during the last week of Jesus' life, where it serves as kind of an explanation for why the authorities decided that Jesus had to die. But the Gospel, according to John, which we read this morning, his version, places this scene at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. In fact, his scene in the temple is his first public act. It happens right after Jesus performs his first miracle by turning water into wine at a wedding in Cana. Now, it's easy to imagine that a guy who could turn water into wine could attract quite a following, right? But this version of Jesus makes us see that there's more to understand about Jesus than his miracles. And it becomes uncomfortably clear when Jesus arrives at the temple during the Passover celebration. Now, Passover at the temple, for the people of Israel, this was the most important holy day of the year at the most sacred place on earth. The temple was the place where heaven and earth met, where God dwelled with God's people. Yet, what Jesus witnessed within the temple gates felt far from sacred to him. The outer court was filled with merchants selling animals for the sacrifice and money changers busy at their tables, exchanging the Greek and Roman coins the pilgrims brought for the Jewish coins that they could use to pay the temple tax. Now, all this commerce was necessary so that the people could do their religious duty. And so it was all part of religious business as usual. But as Jesus stood there watching it all happen, suddenly it was more than he could stand. He grabbed some rope and started whipping the animals and people, furiously demanding that they leave. He knocks over the money changers' tables, pouring the money all over the floor. Jesus brings the business of religion to a screaming halt, right in the middle of the busiest, most important religious festival of the year. But why? What's really bothering Jesus? Now, some scholars suggest that Jesus was furious about the corruption that existed in the temple and the sacrificial system. Pilgrims were being charged exorbitant prices to exchange their money, and for blemished animals that were really unfit for sacrifice, while the authorities just looked the other way. And to some extent, that may have been true. But when Jesus speaks, he says nothing about abuse or corruption. Rather, his words point to something more insidious going on. "Take these things out of here," he cries. "Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." You've made my Father's house a marketplace. Jesus isn't angry about corruption. He's angry about distraction. The religious system, with all its requirements and regulations, had become so involved and so convoluted that the temple no longer felt like the place where God dwelled with God's people. Instead, it had become kind of a religious convenience store where weary travelers could easily stock up on all their necessary religious supplies. In other words, the temple had about as much sense of God's presence in it as does a shopping mall the week before Christmas. So Jesus takes action. He very publicly and forcefully reclaims God's house for God. Yes, Jesus gets angry, but it's a righteous anger born out of a deep love for God and God's people. Now imagine for a moment that you are one of Jesus' followers, standing there watching this whole scene. I mean, you've just left everything to follow Jesus. You've listened to his wonderful teachings, watched him perform miracles, and well, so far it's all been pretty amazing and awesome. But now he does this. He takes on the whole religious system with this outrageous display. Do you suppose they were frightened by the scene? I bet it made them wonder what they had gotten themselves into. I mean, just who is this man that they had decided to follow? All of a sudden, they're given a new way of thinking about Jesus, but it seems to come from an old source. John writes that when the disciples saw Jesus in action in the temple, they remembered these words from Psalm 69. "Zeal for your house will consume me." Zeal. It's a great word we don't hear very much anymore. It means a passionate ardor in the pursuit of anything. Jesus was zealous. He was passionate in his love for God and the things that mattered to God. But zeal is also costly. Ultimately, Jesus' zeal would cost him his life. It would cost many of his disciples their lives. But of course, they don't know that yet as they stand there watching Jesus trash the temple. However, they did know the rest of the psalm they were quoting, and it's a psalm of lament. The psalmist is crying out to God because he is being ridiculed and persecuted for his faith. The psalmist's friends, family, and neighbors mock and insult him for caring so much, too much, for God's will and God's ways. So the disciples must have wondered, is this what we have to look forward to if we continue to follow him? ridicule, insults, rejection. Now, as the disciples are wondering about this, the religious leaders have their own questions. They demand that Jesus give them a sign to show them that he has the authority to do what he's done. So he gives them a sign. He tells them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will raise it up. In his first public act, Jesus announces the radical nature of his ministry. He has come to make the sacrificial system and all its distractions obsolete. And he will do this by becoming the ultimate sacrifice. Through his passion and resurrection, Jesus will become the living temple, the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's love and mercy and grace dwell. This is a shocking and outrageous claim. Jesus has come to overturn much more than a few money changers' tables. This is Jesus taking on the religious status quo, just like the prophets before him. And I think you all know what usually happens to the prophets in Jesus' day and also in our own day. Prophets always speak truth to power, and they pay the price for it, as Jesus will. But that price will have a life-changing impact. As this morning's story closes, John interjects that on that day in the temple, Jesus' followers did not understand what he meant. But after he was raised from the dead, they remembered what he said, and they believed. The way Jesus lived, the way he lovingly and boldly did things and said things, his zeal for God inspired and empowered others to do the same. So I wonder, have you ever been made to feel foolish or maybe just a little old-fashioned for thinking that going to church on Sunday was more important than, say, Little League or a family event? That ever happened to you? Has someone ever looked at you kind of funny when you mentioned praying or reading the Bible or faith? Well, let's face it, that's about as zealous as most Episcopalians get, right? I mean, let's not get too carried away with this God stuff, okay? But of course, that's exactly what Jesus did on that day in the temple. He got carried away with the God stuff. Throughout his earthly ministry, Jesus let his love for God show in a full-bodied love and kindness. And yes, even in holy anger. He spoke up and spoke out against the evil powers of this world that corrupt and destroy the creatures of God, or simply keep those beloved creatures perpetually distracted. And he invites his disciples, that's us folks, to do the same. Now, as I said, this idea of zeal and passionately expressing faith in God makes a lot of Episcopalians just a little bit nervous. It's not really our style. But zeal doesn't have to look like any particular way. And Jesus makes that clear throughout his ministry. And actually, so did one of his most faithful followers. I mentioned him already. Throughout his life, the Reverend Fred Rogers, a Presbyterian minister, expressed his love for God through a zealous commitment to the emotional health and welfare of children. In a quiet, gentle, and unassuming way, Mr. Rogers included people of color, differing ability, and ethnicities in his neighborhood long before we included them in ours. He gave people permission to feel their feelings, even anger. He lobbied Congress as an early advocate for quality content and advertising protections in children's television programming. He risked appearing foolish to some in hopes of reaching little children and their parents with a message of acceptance, inclusion, and hope. The question for us this morning is, are we willing to express our love for God with zeal, whatever form zeal takes in our lives? Are we willing to look foolish to some to bring God's light and God's love to those who desperately need to know it? As we walk through the remaining time of Lent, may God give us the strength and the courage to be zealous and foolish for his sake. Amen.